Welcome to a brand new episode of the Jampack Report today for June the 1st of 2020. Of course, this is a gaming news podcast, and there's a reason for that. Gaming is very easy to discuss. It's very easy to have a conversation and a podcast 5 days a week about video game news. I get off work and I cherry pick about 5 or 6 big news stories, and I come home and I talk about them and I share my 2 cents. There's not really any risk, and it's not really uncomfortable for me to discuss. But you know what is uncomfortable? Talking about society and politics on my channel. It becomes somewhat stressful for me. It's something that makes me, just in general, writhe a bit inside internally. But sometimes the conversations that need to be had aren't the easy conversations to have. Sometimes the difficult podcasts to cut are the ones that need to be cut. And sometimes you need to realize that no matter how uncomfortable I may be recording this podcast and sharing this message out there, it's not nearly as uncomfortable as George Floyd was whenever he choked to death under the knee of a white police officer while 3 other police officers looked on in complacency, bewilderment, astonishment, whatever kind of adjective you want to throw in there. The whole situation is something that needs to be addressed. And for years, as more and more movements have cropped up, I have struggled with the idea of it not being my place to say anything because I just talk about games. Or it's not my place to say anything because what do I have to say? I'm only 20-something years old. It is our place to say something. It is everyone's place to say something. It is your responsibility whenever injustice is being recorded and shared. Whenever you see anything that needs to be addressed, you should address it. That is my opinion. That is the take of millions of other people. As we see over the course of the past week, protests across the world have cropped up in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And this is something that is existent because of a conversation that has been had over the course of the past few years, but it's a movement that goes back decades, and some might even say centuries. This is something that is bigger than you or me. This is something that's bigger than what's happening right now. This is a movement that has the potential to shape the future of our society, not only on an American level, but on an international level. And you really need to take a step back and think, what side of history do I want to be on? Do I want to sit in the corner and be complacent as injustice happens across the world and across the country? Or do I want to stand up and say, you know, there is a problem with police brutality. There is a systemic problem with our justice system. Do you even want to take that a step further and say there's a problem with our society where it is inherently from the get-go rigged to where people like me that are white males automatically have access to a much larger variety of potential career options and levels of success without having to work nearly as hard as those that might be in minorities. That's a very difficult conversation for me to have. That's a very difficult thing for me to say on camera because ultimately I'm afraid of people. I'm afraid of being judged, being ridiculed. I'm afraid of the conversations that come from having this conversation. But I don't really care anymore because I've seen the bravery of people that are protesting in the streets. I have seen people making their voices heard. And ultimately, if I stand to the wayside and I let what's happening happen without at least putting my 2 cents out there and helping spread the word, then I'm just as guilty as anybody else in keeping this system upheld. I'm just as guilty as the establishment by keeping the establishment established. It's a very, again, uncomfortable conversation to have, but it's something that needs to be had. And if you are listening to this, and you've made it this far, and you're thinking about unsubscribing, or you're thinking about writing a nasty comment, or you're thinking about whatever you're thinking about, do it. I don't really care anymore. It's a situation in which I want to be on the right side of history, and I want to do what I know in my heart is right. And that is to back this movement that is simply fighting for equality, and that is simply fighting for equal treatment, and that is simply fighting for reformation of the systems that have been so broken for so many years, for generations. And I want to be on that team. I want to be on the team that is striving to make a more unified society, one that equally treats people in any kind of situation, in any kind of area, in any kind of way. I want that. That is what I want. So I stand with the Black Lives Matter movement. I wanted to say that to begin this show because you can't really just go on with life as usual. You just can't ignore it, and it shouldn't be ignored. It's not something that even marginally should be written off as a byline on a news station. No, that's not the correct term. You know what I'm saying? The ticker tape at the bottom, that thing. No, this is the front news story for today's show. Both literally and metaphorically speaking, because Sony has delayed the PlayStation 5 stream due to ongoing protest. That was the strangest transition I've ever made in this show, for sure. But Sony has delayed its upcoming PlayStation 5 live stream, which would have seen the company show off gameplay from its upcoming next-generation console. The stream was originally scheduled to start at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on June the 4th. The company did not say when it plans to air the rescheduled event. This decision comes in light of the anti-racism protests across the U.S. Quote, while we understand gamers worldwide are excited to see PlayStation 5 games, we do not feel that right now is a time for celebration, and for now we want to stand back and allow more important voices to be heard, the company said. The protests were sparked by the death 1 week ago of 46-year-old George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Earlier in the day, Sony also shared a statement in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, saying, quote, we denounce systemic racism and violence against the black community, the company said. When it first announced the event, Sony said it had planned to share more than an hour of footage from games that would launch on the PlayStation 5. Sony promised contributions from both big and small studios. There was also speculation the company may have teased the design of the console, but to date, all we have seen of the PlayStation 5 has been its DualSense controller, which the company has said will feature a built-in microphone and adaptive triggers. So, this is a bit shocking, but I do think this is ultimately the right move, because as the statement says, there are more important voices that need to be heard right now in the state of the world. And to release news about a PlayStation 5 certainly takes the back seat as compared to any of the societal issues that are coming to light right now, and that are back in the mainstream discussion. On top of that, this is not a conversation around the PlayStation 5 that will lose its value. This is a piece of news that will continue to be news all the way up until the console is released in November. And in a way, if you want to look at the grand scheme of things, the closer Sony can get to July with the Xbox event that is coming, the bigger the, I suppose, cannonball is going to be whenever their big ass hits the pool. If you come out with a God of War 2 and it goes directly against a Halo 5, it's literally like two giant Chungus children doing a double cannonball into the swimming pool. Which wave is going to be bigger? I suppose we'll have to wait and see. But regardless, the June 4th event is not going to be happening, so you can go ahead and mark that one off your calendars, and I will let you guys know when that new date is announced. Google overpromised on Stadia's tech. I know, it's shocking. I'll give you a moment to regain your breath, but this is according to Take-Two CEO. While Google Stadia's gaming streaming tech works, it did not expand the game's audience as some had hoped. That's according to Take-Two CEO Strauss Zelnick's assessment. The veteran games executive spoke at the Bernstein Annual Strategic Decisions Conference via GameSpot about the potential for game streaming and its current realities. More specifically, Zelnick and co. did not expect Stadia to have as little of an impact as it did. Quote, the launch of Stadia has been slow, said Zelnick. I think there was some overpromising on what the technology could deliver and some consumer disappointment as a result. Zelnick, of course, is more interested in how streaming has the potential to attract many more players, the likes of whom will never buy a game console. This is part of what encouraged Take-Two to support Stadia early on. Quote, anytime you broaden distribution, you potentially broaden your audience, which is why we supported the release of Stadia with 3 titles initially and will continue to support high-quality streaming services as long as the business model makes sense, he explained. The belief that streaming was going to be transformative was based on a view that there were loads of people who really had an interest in interactive entertainment, really wanted to pay for it, but just didn't want to have a console. I'm not sure that turned out to be the case, he added. With that in mind, Zelnick says game streaming is going to work and matter on a broader scale down the line. I agree with Mr. Zelnick in this specific situation because I do believe game streaming is going to be a large part of how we play games in the future. I completely see that possibility because of the success of Netflix. Now, while these services are different, one serving movies and television shows, one serving games, the technology that can make it possible is similar in so many ways, and the adoption of Netflix is ultimately something that killed an entire industry. You now only have family video, and that's because their stores are bought in terms of real estate instead of rented out like Blockbuster. Otherwise, there would be no rental system around whatsoever. And so to see Netflix completely decimate the competition and almost really force Redbox out of business at this point is a reminder of just how powerful the accessibility of streaming actually is in terms of changing the intake habits of many people that are watching movies, playing games, and ultimately taking in entertainment. So, will Stadia make a comeback? I highly doubt it personally, but I do think the technology is foundational to where the future is going. However, let's talk about technology that is not foundational. The first Atari VCS units should be ready by mid-June. Atari's repeatedly delayed VCS console is nearly ready 2 years after its announcement. The team has revealed that the first 500 or so Atari VCS production models should leave the factory by mid-June. That will still leave the majority of the Atari 2s. I was reading this incorrectly. That will still leave the majority of Atari's 11,597 crowdfunding backers waiting, but the team cautiously expects that production for those will get underway this summer now that the parts are available. Things are still falling into place. Atari has yet to detail the full software lineup for the VCS, even with a game subscription deal locked in, but nonetheless, this is good news for backers worried about multiple delays, changing specs, and behind-the-scenes drama that might prevent the system from shipping. Whether or not the VCS succeeds is another matter. It's a relatively powerful device for the money with an embedded Ryzen chip and some PC-like functionality, but there is also no guarantee it will be a nostalgia-inducing console of your dreams, especially if the Atari 2600 does not mean much to you. I have never in my life seen a console that has gotten so much of a bad rap. That's not even the correct term. I think that the expectations for the Atari VCS were set in such a strange way to begin with that those that were excited were inevitably bound to be disappointed, and those that were hopeful were also disappointed. I don't understand why this piece of technology exists. Now, I'm trying to be positive about the entire thing because aesthetically, the VCS looks cool. I like the wood paneling on the front. I like the throwback to the Atari 2600, but ultimately, in a world where the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One are on their way out the door, and you have a new generation of consoles coming in that is going to be multiple times as powerful as the Atari VCS was ever going to be, how do you compete in that world? I think that ultimately what the Atari VCS is going to end up being is a system that is slowly but surely evolved to become somewhat of a nostalgia machine. It's going to become the gaming console that you go to play classic Atari games, and occasionally you can play some kind of small modern arcade game like Pac-Man Championship Edition or something along those lines. Tempest 4000 is a good example. And there could be a market for that if Atari specifically went after these classic game developers and they created these classic style experiences that can be played on the Atari. That might be a good route for marketing, but ultimately there really isn't a reason for that thing to exist, especially considering the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5 are coming. Which, speaking of which, Mercury is the codename of a large Xbox Store update coming soon. Recently, an Xbox Insider Program update made an app called Mercury available to a few testers with a splash screen that just reads as coming soon. Please upgrade to access the latest and greatest. I received a few messages about it and thought I would try it to find out more about what it is and what it does, since some had speculated it might be something related to Project xCloud, says the author at Windows Central. After doing some digging, it seems that this app is the codename of an upcoming Xbox Store redesign, rebuilt from the ground up on new architecture designed for 4K TVs. This new store app is also destined for use on next-gen systems like the Xbox Series X and long-rumored Xbox Lockhart, as well as current-gen Xbox One systems. From what we have seen so far, the design of the Mercury store app is almost identical to what is available on Xbox One consoles today, with many of the changes appearing to be under the hood. It's possible that more features and design changes will occur as the app moves closer to public testing, especially given the modernized design language we see in apps like Xbox Beta and Xbox Game Bar on PC. If you try to install Mercury from the Microsoft Store to your console right now, the download simply fails. But it probably won't be too long until testers in the Alpha and Alpha Skip Ahead rings are able to take a closer look at it. And of course, once we know more, they will share it on the Windows Central blog or website, whatever you want to call it. So, first and foremost, I want to talk about the fact that this is supposedly going to be very similar to the current Xbox One store design. Why? I have a problem with the PlayStation Store and the Xbox Store, and that problem is that both of them are completely unoptimized, I guess is the best way to put it. There is nothing about the experience of browsing on either of the newest generation consoles that feels like a UI designer even held a controller in his or her hands. They are so clunky, they are so dysfunctional. If you want to watch a trailer on both storefronts, I believe, it starts off in like 360p, and then often you can't even pull up the full screen video, and if you can, the navigation is a monstrosity in terms of trying to find a game you actually want to play. Now, I'll admit that I think personally the Xbox Store currently is a bit better than the PlayStation Store in its current state in 2020. But if you are going to complete an entire overhaul of the storefront, whether it be on PlayStation or Xbox, do a whole overhaul. Because, especially with a new generation console coming up, just save the storefront UI revamp for the launch of the new console and just put it out alongside it and say, hey, here's a benefit of having a new generation console coming. We can dump this horrid storefront. I don't understand how this has made it this long with the state that it currently is in. But one storefront that's a bit better is the Nintendo Switch store. Of course, I believe it's the eShop, but it could have changed names. But Xenoblade Chronicles on Switch sells double of the Wii original. The new Nintendo Switch version of Xenoblade Chronicles has doubled the game's original launch sales on Wii. Monolith Soft's Definitive Edition re-release of the game debuted in first place within this week's UK box game charts. This Director's Cut release offers numerous gameplay tweaks, shinier visuals, and remastered music throughout, as well as an all-new epilogue. It comes a full decade after Xenoblade Chronicles' original debut on Wii in Japan, which only reached Western shores years later after hardcore fans petitioned Nintendo for its localization. The Nintendo-exclusive RPG series has since spawned a couple of sequels, while Chronicles' protagonist has joined the Super Smash Bros. Roster. Sales were up on the Wii U's Xenoblade Chronicles X, but down slightly on fellow Switch release Xenoblade Chronicles 2, launched during the busy 2017 Christmas sales season and not during a pandemic. And as ever, there are physical sales only. Digital downloads are not counted. It's likely many more people downloaded the Definitive Edition with shops shut. Last week, Martin wrote, a Eurogamer, that the package felt like the Xenoblade formula perfected in his warm write-up of Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition's many new features. So, as expected, the console that is currently crushing most other pieces of hardware does in fact have higher sales of a game that came out on the Wii, which was also a very popular game. But this worldwide Definitive Edition release is something that I think definitely did the game some favors, so congrats to the team behind the scenes at Nintendo. And before we round out today's show, I do want to talk about this bit of drama that happened over the weekend in the Vita community, because Killzone Mercenary's online servers have not actually been turned off. Over the weekend, you may have read reports that Sony had turned off the multiplayer servers for PlayStation Vita exclusive Killzone Mercenary all of a sudden. Players reported that they were unable to connect to online matches, with one particular user questioning customer service support staff on the topic. They apparently confirmed that the multiplayer servers had been shut down, but that is not actually the case whatsoever. It just appears to have been a random outage because devout fans are joining multiplayer matches all over again, and the Sixth Axis is reporting that it can join online lobbies at the time of writing. Quote, before publishing this story, we did a check as some people were posting that the servers were working and decided to check the servers for ourselves by digging out the Vitas and our copies of Killzone Mercenary. Both Tef and I, they write, at of course the 6th axis, and I managed to join a lobby after we updated our PS Vita and game files, so it was probably just a minor glitch over the weekend. It looks like some more dedicated players simply jumped the gun and feared the worst. To be fair, those worries aren't exactly misplaced. Sony has a history of turning off online servers, but at least the hardware manufacturer never does it without warning. As such, you can still play Killzone Mercenary online for right now, and thank God, because this is one of the best games on the Vita. If you do not have a PlayStation Vita, I would encourage you to get one if you can for like 50 or 60 bucks on eBay. And Killzone Mercenary is a phenomenal shooter that is designed from the ground up for the Vita experience. And the multiplayer was not that bad either. Now the campaign, phenomenal. It's great. Just so good. I highly recommend it. But really glad to see this one is still online. While I might not go back and play it, I do want other people to be able to experience this game, especially since you can get it now for, what, a couple of bucks in a bargain bin? It's just a wonderful deal, and I hope it continues to thrive well into the future. But that rounds out today's episode of the Jampack Report. Of course, if you made it all the way to the end, I do want to say I will not get political on this channel often. I will not get social justice-y unless it is entirely warranted and necessary, and in this case, it simply was. But I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your night. I'll talk to you soon, and peace.